Hi, welcome to Peer Supportcast. Today I have two lovely guests from Peer Support, Sara and Leia. And today we're going to be talking about sex and mental health. So please feel free to, if you're listening to this, feel free to clean your room or wash your dishes. Do something to stay productive during this whole episode so that you don't have to interrupt your daily activities. Make some coffee, make some tea, make yourself cozy in your bed or in your couch if you have one. And yeah, let's get started with today's episode. So we're going to be talking about sex and mental health. By sex, we don't necessarily mean penetrative sex, but all different forms of sex that we'll discuss later on. It's important as well to acknowledge that sex is a very individual discovery in a way, and therefore everyone's at different places in their sex life. So we're going to discuss this more in depth later on, but what we're going to say might be only relevant to our sexual life, and it's not necessarily something that you can generalize. So yeah, please introduce yourselves. You've seen Leia in another episode,
Yeah.
but you can introduce yourself as well. And yeah.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm Sarah. I'm currently the co-chair of peer support, and I'm also a second year and studying social sciences, and I'm kind of focusing on psychology and sociology, but I'm also kind of very interested in kind of gender and sexuality studies, or also having these kind of conversations, because I just think that it's really important to talk about, and also having a lot of conversations with friends about these things. I feel like we can all always learn a lot from one another, and also sometimes I feel like people have insecurities, and then when you talk about it, it's like, oh, you realize other people have the same thoughts, and then it just, I don't know, I think it's just really good to talk about.
I'm Leia. Third year, graduating this year. My studies really focused on visual culture and race theory. And in terms of sexuality, I think that I don't necessarily think that I've studied it at an academic level. It's more so something that I've had conversations with friends about, and topics that I've researched on my own and in my own time, especially in relation to this specific topic, sexuality and mental health, and the intersection between those two and how one influences the other. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to be here, to have this conversation with them.
Yeah, and I'm very glad to have you here on the podcast. It's not a topic that we talk about for the first time together, so I'm also excited to see where this conversation goes. One thing that I wanted to say as well is that we're of course not only going to talk about heterosexual relationships, but yeah, we're going to talk about sex in general. So more on the scientific side of things. Sex is known to be it's great. It's a great thing, right? Like, it brings a lot of pleasure. We release a lot of serotonin with sex, so that can boost our mood or confidence. There's been a lot of studies that have shown that people who have regular sexual intercourses have lower levels of anxiety, and it can also help with depression. There's studies more specifically on when we had the COVID pandemic. During lockdown, there was a big problem with social isolation, and so some people were in a lockdown with their partners, some people weren't, and studies have shown that people who had who could have sex during that period were overall less stressed about it. But yeah, there's a lot of issues around sex and mental health, because they're very intertwined topics, in the sense that sex brings a lot of great things, right? But it's also difficult. It can be difficult sometimes to enjoy sex if your mental health doesn't follow. Anxiety can lead to a lot of stress, and this stress can have a lot of impacts, physical and mental impacts on your ability to enjoy sex. Yeah.
No, yes, absolutely. And adding on to that, it it's at least, especially when your mood is declining, and not only like your mood is declining, and then you also get that your mood treated where you take medication like antidepressants that are called SSRIs, and basically they're meant to uptake and like boost your serotonin, but in doing so they also serve to lower your levels of dopamine and make it so that you have a much harder time to feel sexually inclined, and then also to orgasm, and also to stay like willing and wanting to stay in the sexual activity. So when a lot of people who are familiar with the connection between like depression and anxiety and also mental health, they recognize that when they are in those low times, sex is something that's so far away from their mind. It's not something that they think about or that they're even like willing to participate in, which in itself adds on to that like depressing feeling, like that feeling of adds on to that feeling. And also then you don't get the same type of, you're not able to get the enjoyment and also that the surplus of like the chemicals, the happy chemicals essentially that can be boosted.
Oxytocin,
serotonin, dopamine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there's like both aspects to it, kind of where maybe like depression or anxiety lead you to, I guess, have less of a desire to have sex, but then also how maybe having sex can cause a lot of people to have anxiety, or whether it's about like social pressure or like body image that causes you to be like uncomfortable during sex. Or I guess like a lot of things come up because in a way it's like you open up like a vulnerable space, and then that can like go either way. I guess it's like maybe it can be a very enjoyable experience like of being vulnerable and you're kind of like met with love, but then at the same time it can also be like very confrontational or uncomfortable at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I mean, your sexual life can have a lot of impacts on your self-esteem, but also, of course, it's very related to emotions, right? You with oxytocin, literally, it's the love hormone. That's ways in which you can enhance how you feel loved, right? Or you feel appreciated, we feel connected, and as the animals we need this intimacy, right? And in a lot of cases, people who lack this intimacy, that can be a huge driver for like depressive episodes. But sexual intercourse doesn't have to be so closely linked to your emotions as well. Everyone has different approaches to sex, and some people approach it more as a recreative thing in a way, or it's important as well to just acknowledge that not everyone experiences sex in the same way and doesn't involve their emotions to the same extent as well. I wanted to ask you guys, so you were talking about how in periods of low, when your mental health is it's more challenging for you to entertain a healthy relationship with your own mind. It's also difficult to engage or even think about sex because your libido goes down, have less sexual drive, and also maybe you're just feeling like isolating yourself a bit more, and so going for that interaction with someone is much more challenging as well. From personal experience, have you felt firsthand this relation between your mental health being down and your sexual life also being impacted negatively by that?
I would say yes, at least for me. I think for me, it's... Yeah, I would say. I mean, there's a lot of other contributing factors to it, but I do think that there is an inherent link that I've experienced in my past between my sex life and also my sexuality, and then linked to my mental health, because the reality is that when you are struggling with depression and high levels of anxiety, you want to be far more reclusive and you don't want to be perceived, you don't want to be seen, and so that's the thing about sex. It's about being seen and being with other people and being intimate with another person in that type of way. And at least for me, and again, as you pointed out in the beginning, there's some individuals who it's that high level of vulnerability and intimacy is not something that they take on so personally and like carry with them and carry with them all the time, but I do. And so it was like I could not, at least in the past when I was going through those really difficult times, I just could not see myself getting sexually involved with somebody, because it felt like there was a lot that was first of all going to be put into the event, and then also at the same time I wasn't interested.
Yeah. Now I wanted to ask about like another thing that is related to mental health, which is, I don't know if you've experienced it, but sometimes there's a thing called arousal non-concordance, which is when your body and your mind are not really on the same page. Where maybe from, let's say, your body is aroused, but mentally you're not necessarily you're not aroused, or even just not willing even to do things. And that's something that is important as well to just be aware of.
Absolutely. Or otherwise the other flip side, where it's like,
oh yeah, clearly
you are very much mentally aroused, but your body is like, I can't, like,
clearly
I'm not into this, I don't want to participate in this, or it's like I don't recognize the cues. And not only being aware of that, but also being kind towards yourself when that happens, because I think that there's a lot of shame that's associated, when people have those type of experiences, regardless of the gender that you have. But I think that there needs to be this type of sympathy that you have towards yourself, and also towards the person or the people that you're having this sexual encounter with, that there might be a discordance, and also being respectful of that when the person recognizes it and then is like, I don't want to participate anymore because there's clearly something up.
Yeah. And also, kind of, we talked about this a bit when we had the kind of conversation about this before, but how maybe there's like an expectation to make the other person feel like maybe they're attractive, or they're able to turn you on in a way, or maybe if you don't feel very like into whatever you're doing, that doesn't always have to do something with the other person, or that doesn't mean the other person is attractive. Or I think also I've talked to a friend where it felt like, or she after a while kind of felt like she had to have sex with someone because it had been so long, and she didn't want to make the other person feel unattractive.
So in the context of a relationship, right? Yeah,
in a way. And also kind of how medication, or like, for example, the pill can also influence your sex drive. So in a way, if you're taking the pill to be able to have sex, but then at the same time it can kind of reduce arousal in a way. Like, that's also kind of two conflicting things that you then have to navigate with, I guess, the other person. And then
I think it's very interesting that you say these things are like these pressures that we have. There's a lot of them. The one that you mentioned, in the sense of when you're with someone and there's this, of course, this association between sex life and your perception of your partner. If you're sexually active, it shows that in a way it's a way that a lot of people take to reassure themselves that they're being loved, or like the other person is attracted to them. But as you say, there's a lot of other factors that can affect your sexual arousal, the fact that you're taking the pill, even a lot of other more simple things. But you can be simply, I don't know, tired, or just not willing to do it at that specific moment because of anything that you have to do in your life or that you've done before. And I think it's important to kind of address that issue. It's very much a communication issue, and it's important to talk things through, because in a way I understand that from one hand you might need reassurance, and on the other it's important to make it clear that you're just not into it at the moment, and it's important to make that point as well, so that you don't feel the pressure as well of, because the other pressure that I was going to talk about is not only the pressure to make your partner feel loved, but also the pressure to perform so that they love you. You know, there's this pressure of performing. So that's for all genders as well. Just the pressure of giving pleasure to the other. I feel like for a lot of people, I'd say probably including myself, sometimes sex becomes more of an act in which you prioritize much more the pleasure of your partner than yours, and which can be good, but at the same time it's important that you don't forget what you want, what you need, and that also you express it. Because if you don't express it, then how can you expect as well the other to express their needs? In the end, that's also leads to a conversation about how do you communicate what you want effectively, so that everyone everyone enjoys it.
Absolutely.
Because I think a lot of things that happen as well with, I don't know, it happens a lot for young people with movies or pornography. There's a lot of kind of informal teaching ways that at least people treat those sources as ways of teaching yourself, and like I know a lot, like I haven't done that myself, but I know a lot of people who have looked, how do you masturbate someone, or how do you know, because you want to perform well as well, especially when you're not experienced, and you have these, you don't really know how to build your self-confidence around that, because you're a beginner, literally, because in the end sex is almost like, it's not a sport, but it's something that you practice and that you learn. And the thing that is very important to note is that the learning curve is not steep, but it's first of all, it's not linear, and it doesn't really have an end. Like I think the path of your journey in sex life doesn't really end. You can always learn more, and that also happens with partners. You should not approach, that's a personal belief, that's not fact based, but I personally think that you should not approach sex in the same way with all of your partners throughout your life, because it's such an individual thing, not only biologically but mentally. Like people react differently, people have different ways they enjoy sex, different ways of being stimulated, and so sex is going to be different with everyone.
Absolutely. I mean, you had something that I wanted to comment on
for sure
a while back, but I hate to say this, I don't remember what it was. It was that link, that continuous link of like communicating with another person, communicating, and again, another person or with multiple people, because you can have like sexual relations with multiple people at any given time. I think what it was, I think that you talked about was how do you have that conversation, and how do you speak to someone in order for yourself to be heard. But the thing that I wanted to comment on, actually, I remember it was on the idea of when you're like watching a film, or when you're watching like that sexual content or like pornography, this idea of like consent, and also like, at least in French, les non-dits, like the things that are like not necessarily said.
The unsaid things.
The unsaid things, exactly. The unsaid things that like asking permission to be able to be with a person in that type of moment, like to take off their clothes, to touch them in this type of way, to experience them in this type of way. There's a lot of that in film, that, and at least in like things that are filmed, that are not talked about. And that in itself also impacts the way that you also understand, at least I let me talk about myself personally, but at least for me, this whole idea of like consent and asking permission continuously to be granted access to myself and also to other people is extremely important. And when I watch films and when I watch certain forms of like content, it feels like it's not something that's talked about, where it's like there's not a lot of conversation happening, there's not a lot of talking, but a lot of action. which in itself is not necessarily problematic, but it means that for people who are like overthinkers and have a lot of anxiety and have a lot of issues surrounding personal space and like personal space and also perception, like personal perception, there's that lack of visibility that is at least in current day media, and it means that you then feel like you need to perform in ways that go kind of against yourself and against the ways that you want to be enjoying yourself truly. Yeah,
I have so many points to comment on. So, first of all, oh no, I mean, I forgot one of them.
exactly.
It's difficult. Because you talked about the thing about kind of the pressure about consent, right? Because of all the media that you consume, there's things that are unsaid, right? That are given. You know, things that are just, expected in a way. Well, expected, but not necessarily, and that's the problem with it, is that some people expect it, some people don't, and that's why you shouldn't assume that someone expects something, which leads to my second point. My first point is there's a thing that is I want to talk about, which is sometimes consent is, let's say, seen as not attractive or as not sexually arousing.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna give a very first, like an example that we will all relate to, and then it shows how this underlying psychology behind that is it manifests throughout a lot of different things within sex. But there's this notion of asking for consent for a kiss, which is something that is usually seen as more acceptable in a way, or more, it's tend to we put less pressure on each other as a society to ask for consent for a kiss, for example. There's a whole seduction game and some cues that are commonly talked about, right? Like ways of indicating interest. But I have had conversations with people that have said that asking for consent can be a turnoff, and so that only. I'm not generalizing. I'm not talking about sex. I'm really this point really specifically applies to kissing. But I think so. My point is that there's not only the importance of expressing what you want, but also making sure that you're receptive towards the person communicating their own boundaries, because it can be very difficult because when you're asking for consent, you're doing it for the other person, of course, but you're also doing it for yourself. Because I think you want to make sure that you're not doing something that crosses the boundaries of the other person.
Yeah.
In order to be comfortable doing it, you need to make sure that the other person is. And so when you get to the moment where you're gonna ask for consent, if the other person has a negative reaction to that, what does it teach you? What does it teach you? It's dangerous as well. So it's dangerous to, and I don't think people who are, if let's say for the example of the kiss, if you think I'm no one to judge. I'm no one to judge if that is good or not. That you think that it's not appealing to you. Like that's a personal preference, but you can communicate that. But it's important that you're careful with the way you react to it, because you don't want to signal to the other person that consent is bad.
Oh, absolutely.
I feel like the reason why consent is so important is that it gives the other person the time to like consider whether they really want something. Because if someone just takes the initiative to, for example, I don't know, take off your pants, for example, it's like I feel like sometimes it's like easier to go along with it, or even if you're not sure if you want something, then maybe in that moment you just go along because you're not sure. And then if someone like straight up asks you like, oh, is this okay with you? Then it gives the person like, okay, like, do I want this? Do I not want this? And it gives them the space to say like, oh, maybe I don't.
Yeah.
And I think in that way it already creates like a safer environment. And also what you said earlier about like safe, like sex being more like kind of like discovering. I think like when I started enjoying sex, it was more when it became like a, okay, let's like, we both probably don't really fully know what we're doing.
Yeah.
Like, let's like try things out together, and then also see like how the other person like checking in between. And yeah, I mean, maybe if someone's okay with something in the beginning, then maybe they're not later. But then also giving like kind of creating a space where you can say like if you're not enjoying something, and then not be and not have it be say something about the other person's performance. It's more like, this is my own body and I'm not enjoying this right now, and it's not because you're doing anything wrong. It's just because like it doesn't feel good right now.
Clearly.
I think at the end of the day is also the protection of your mental health, you know, while you're having these like sexual encounters and when you're with somebody. As you pointed out, like, you're not telling that other person because you're trying to be mean or rude or anything like that, but because you're trying to protect yourself at the end of the day, you know? And you're trying to protect yourself and also like have a good time. And you don't want to look back on it and be like, fuck, I shouldn't have done that. Or I shouldn't have said yes to that, or I shouldn't have, you know, like, you don't want regrets linked to sex. At least that's the way that I see it. There's some people who think that that in itself is a whole experience, you know, like the regretfulness of it. But if it's something that you are really ruminating on and thinking about continuously, then it clearly is something that impacted you and impacted your emotional side, and that's stuff that you carry around, at least.
And I think during sex sometimes like these moments come up where you're like unsure or feel like a discomfort about things, and I feel like sometimes we don't know ourselves how to respond to them. But I've had times where I had discomfort and then I like just kept going anyways, because it was like, okay, but then later I always feel like in a way I like disrespected my body. And I feel like I've talked to people who have had similar experiences where then afterwards you feel this kind of like this like uncomfortable feeling with yourself, and I don't know. And then in those cases it's not always like something the other person did, but then also something you didn't know about yourself that you were maybe uncomfortable with. So I feel like also learning or how to ask like, okay, can we take a break? Like, I don't know, that doesn't mean that, you know, maybe you will completely stop having sex, but maybe like taking like a minute to also like talk about it with the other person. Oh, like, what just made you like feel uncomfortable? What made you anxious? Because I think I have a lot of moments during sex where I feel like, okay, like, this is too much for me. And then like talking about it can really help, and then also make the experience like overall better, where then later I don't feel like, oh, like I did something that I didn't really want to do.
And so to come back to the unsaid things, the things that we take for given, a big thing is taking for given penetrative sex. I know you wanted to talk about it, but just to kind of open up that discussion, there's this assumption that is very generalized that having sex is having penetrative sex, and that also that eventually, even if, let's say, at some point you don't have penetrative sex, but you go through other things, it will happen at some point. And I think that's something that you might ask for consent for a lot of things, and sometimes it's taken for given to such an extent that we just assume that it will happen. Like, I don't know if you have, I know you probably have some things to add on that, but I don't know.
I think the kind of assumption that, or at least having sex with a man in a way, there's kind of, I guess, assumption in society that like sex, when you're having sex, like, or someone asked me once like, oh, why do you always call penetrative sex and not just sex? And then I was like, well, to me penetrative sex is like a kind of sex, but it's not the whole experience. And I think like calling, like, it's harmful in a way where it creates this assumption. Well, first of all, that like it's a very heteronormative assumption, but also this assumption that sex is only sex if there's penetrative sex involved, and then there's kind of this pressure that, well, either if you don't want penetrative sex in the beginning, that maybe at one point, like, it's always like, oh yeah, we can wait until you're comfortable, but then it's always like there's still an assumption that eventually like you'll be willing to have penetrative sex. And I think that in itself is not really.
I have a question for the both of you. I think that not necessarily about this. It's one that I had a couple of seconds ago.
Yeah.
A couple of thoughts ago.
The point was finished.
But when you guys were being raised, and I'm not saying like as you were growing up, was sex something that was tied into mental health? Was it something that people were like, or people in your life, perhaps family members, perhaps your friends, or even in like at school or in research, was it something that was linked to mental health? Was it something that was like, it can boost your mental health or it can decline during your mental health? Or
for me, I mean, it depends a lot of in different areas. Like, I feel it was very much tied to more physical health. Physical health always, not so much to mental health, although growing up, notions such as consent, I don't know, were things that were always, I guess, part of my education and part of the education for in people around me as well. Not only for sex, but I think it's more like a way of a worldview of like you're. And there's I think it's a French saying, I'm not sure, but about freedom, which is that your freedom stops where the other person's begins. And well, it can be applied to a lot of things, and it can also be applied to sex, right? And so I think it's more even if it was not directly taught through sex, I think that philosophy was very much part of my education and therefore included in my belief system. But I think for example, I think my parents would tie it to mental health when talking about it. Not too much though, but there was the idea that it's supposed to be enjoyable, and it's not something that is necessarily something that, I don't know, is meant to happen as well, you know. I think that for sure. But on the other hand, I feel like growing up, there was this pressure, which I wanted to talk about as well, when you were talking about this thing where if we consider sex to be penetrative sex, right? I think that comes a lot from this pressure that a lot of people have of, so sex is something that is inherently part of the human experience, and having sex is part of growing up. It's almost like a ritual for a lot of people. It's something that is like, when you grow up, you talk about it. You, even though from you talk about it from a perspective where you have no clue, but you still talk about it a lot as a teenager, and there's these things where like, oh, your first friends to do it are cool, you know, because they're adults, they're grown up, you know, they did it. But then what, I mean, maybe they lied to you. They probably did. They probably did. But what makes them have this new status is really the penetrative sex and not just sex. Because a lot of people, if you ask a lot of people, I don't know, I don't really have a judgment on it, on whether it's correct or not, but virginity is very much associated with penetrative sex. There's a lot of people who will call themselves virgins, even though they've done a lot of, let's say, I don't know, preliminary sex or other forms of sex, oral sex, etc. And there's this pressure, right, of if you don't have penetrative sex, you can't call it sex, and therefore,
absolutely,
and therefore,
absolutely.
you can't brag about it to your friends.
Yeah, absolutely.
No.
Absolutely. And it's like, that's, again, as you were, I think
Yeah.
you spoke about it, this idea that it's like very, not only heteronormative, but also really reductive. You know, like it only encompasses a certain group of people and only a certain experience, when there's a multitude of experiences related to sex and sexuality. And again, as we pointed to at the beginning, it's like sex is something that's very personal. So for some individuals, they are virgins up until they have penetrative sex. And for some other individuals, it was like their first preliminary sexual experience, you know, was already them like losing quote unquote virginity. Again, I also think that virginity in itself is like a social construct. I think it's like something that was created like centuries ago to repress, I think, women at the end of the day. But one thing that you talked about was really this bonding type of thing that happens, not when you have with your sexual partner, but with your friends as well, when you talk about sex, you know, and the impact that has, again, on your mental health, and also your experience of like, you know, your experience of like relationality and also like friendship when you are a person who's not having sex, you know, or a person who isn't having the same type of sex as everybody else in the group, you know, like you could be part of a group of people who like has sex regularly and you haven't had sex in a very long time, or it's like it's not something that's interesting to you, but or otherwise you could be the person who has sex very frequently, and then the people in your group are kind of like, I don't really care about that, you know. So then how does that influence you? I feel like you have something to say, Sarah.
No, I think just kind of what you said earlier. In one of my classes we learned about this hierarchy of sexualities. I think Gail Ruin suggested that like whatever's at the top is like seen as the most valued and like given the most like mental sanity, not sanity, but in a way it's like the most recognized, and the top is like heteronormative sex and marriage, and then there's like just heterosexual sex like in, I guess, couples, or I guess things, and then after that I think is like non-heterosexual sex within couples, and then everything that's kind of underneath is like either not straight sex, or like I guess sex work, or anything that doesn't really fit into this belief of like, or like this idea of like family structure and reproduction, and kind of how this whole thing is also upheld by and like kind of proven in a way by virginity. Like if you like through the way society perceives it can lose your virginity, then also you're having heterosexual sex in a way, because otherwise it's like, what I mean, it's also constructed, but how do you like lose your virginity? Or also in queer sex, like it's just all such blurry lines, and it kind of upholds this like hierarchy of like, if you have lost your virginity, then in a way it's like a bit of a social status, as you said, and you can like have like talk about it in conversations with friends, but then also how other people, and I guess we kind of addressed this at the beginning, but are in such different places in their sex life, and like some people start masturbating super early when they're, I don't know, super young, and then some people just start when, I don't know, maybe mid-20s, or just,
and there's not like there's not a correct rhythm of discovery, you know, and I think, as you were saying, is very interesting, the fact that it's a social tool to be able to have these experiences, because it allows you to relate to people.
Absolutely.
And when you don't, you can definitely feel excluded. And growing up, like, is very I feel like I've been in both ends of like feeling that I was late, and as well very much feeling that I was ahead of other people. And it's interesting to see that, for example, talking to people when we were in our teens, that were not very sure of their own sexuality because they've never felt, let's say, sexual arousal towards someone else, right? And then you talk with the same person years later on, and it's like their journey of discovery started, and now they have, let's say, more answers, although there's not as I said before, it's a continuous thing, and I feel like it's not something that is fixed. And I feel like not only your sexuality, but also the things that you like doing. It's very much subject to change, or the things that induce sexual arousal in you are also very much subject to change. But so yeah, I think it's very difficult for a lot of people that can't really relate, not only because maybe their lack of experience, but maybe if you're in a social group where, I mean, that happens a lot, but if you don't relate to heterosexuals, like heterosexual sex, it's if you're in an environment where, let's say, people are more close-minded, it can be very difficult, I think, to even though you can talk about it openly.
Yeah.
So that's also another issue. But you touched upon masturbation, and I think it's a very a good cue to start talking about it, about the importance of masturbation within your journey of self-discovery, and how it can enable you to communicate better about the things you like to your partner or to whoever you're having sex with. I don't know if you have anything to elaborate on that, on the benefits of masturbation. I mean, there's a lot of physical benefits, of course, and mental benefits. We've talked about it already, but sex and orgasms are a very well-known way of releasing stress. But there's also the importance of it in being able to know yourself and your body and what you enjoy, so that you can also not stand up for yourself, but almost stand up for yourself in a way. When you're having sex, you're able to understand why certain things don't feel good, or why certain things feel good, precisely. I also wanted to talk about maybe the thing about the whole taboo around masturbation, because that's a thing that's very much socially accepted for men, and for women.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then it becomes then it has impacts on the sexual life of a lot of people who engage in sexual relationships, but haven't done this, let's say, not preliminary necessarily, because
But the
masturbation is not something that stops once you start having sex. But I don't know, a whole discussion would be your individual sexual life within a sexual relationship with someone. But yeah, so what is your experience with this taboo? Or not necessarily your individual experience, but in your own environments where you grew up, like family, school, was that very predominant? Sorry for the voice crack. Not enough tea.
I think for me, I mean, I feel like I knew about boys masturbating, but I never, or maybe I wasn't aware that girls do it, so I also never really like consciously picked up when people talked about it. But it never like occurred to me until I like discovered it about myself, and then only later I like found out that there's a word for it, and that it's called masturbation, and that girls also masturbate. And I think like there's kind of two sides of masturbation, where there's like can automatically be a lot of shame around it, and then if you masturbate, also sensing that shame. But I think it can also be a tool to like reclaim kind of your pleasure in a way, and that it can be like a way to also counter that shame and have like experiences by yourself that are very enjoyable, and then also with time maybe like loosen shame, or also like body insecurities that you have. And I don't know, in a way it's like, I guess, a form of like self-love, but I think initially, or a lot of the times, it's very associated with shame, especially maybe for women. And yeah, the fact that we're not even like really educated about it. Yeah, I don't know if maybe.
At least for me, in terms of like masturbation was never something that was ever talked about at home or in my friend group, or it wasn't anything that was ever brought into conversation. So if it was something that I ever encountered, like when I finally did encounter it, it was again very personal. It was just like based off of things that I was like reading or seeing online, but it wasn't anything that I ever talked about with actual people in my life. And even to this day, I feel like it's such a strange thing, and I don't know if you guys encounter this, but people have a much easier time talking about a sexual encounter that they have with another person versus like a masturbation session or like a moment that they had with themselves. And I think it's because it feels like when you're talking about another person and with another person, it feels so normalized and so easy to a certain degree, and so that's what I'm more familiar with versus even talking about like self-pleasuring. And it doesn't even have to be like masturbation, but like self-pleasuring, like including different things into that self-pleasure, whether it be toys or other forms of other products. And I don't know, it just, at least as I've gotten older, I feel like I've done more research into it, and like there's academics and papers written about it, but then like personal conversations and education with like face to face, it's not something that's ever happened. And I think it's because, as you pointed out, there's this shame and there's this little awkwardness as well that we haven't acknowledged socially, where we're not like talking about those moments that we have with ourselves at the same time. Like someone would say, yeah, but you're not going to sit down and talk about a meal that you had with yourself, you know, like a meal that you sat down and had dinner with yourself last night, you know, or a TV show that you watched alone, and that experience. But I don't know, that's the way that I, at least as a woman, experienced it.
I mean, I think for men it's a very different story in the sense that it's very normalized even from a young age.
I've always been jealous of that.
And I mean, yeah, it's it has its good things and bad things, because then it's a very easy release of dopamine, right? And that can lead to, with a lot of problems, it can lead to addiction.
True.
Go watch the episode on addiction, it's very interesting. It can lead to it can, just like social media, using your phone, I don't know, texting. I think the phone is the one thing that I'm most familiar with in terms of addiction and micro interruptions of your day. Well, it's the same thing with masturbation. I've heard stories of friends or people who have a relationship with masturbation that can be very unhealthy, not in the long run. Let's say, for example, in periods of stress, or in periods where they spend a lot of time alone, when you don't have any distractions. It's like, it's gonna be a very silly example, but a lot of, like, if you talk, I've talked to a lot of people who just, you know, like, you're just chilling watching a show or like looking at a movie, and you just scratch your balls, and it's one thing leads to the other. No, but it's true, and like, it's funny, I know, but then it can create this cycle of, whenever I don't know what to do, I do it, and it can be very harmful to your overall productivity, or like your it can also be harmful to your social life, because although I still do believe in all the points that I've said before on how it's important to discover your own body and you know, experience these things, there's also a balance to find, because let's say the energy that you put into it is, when you orgasm, it's you might lose a momentum, right? You lose you might lose the energy to do other things, you know, because it's I mean, I'm going to talk for men because that's what I'm familiar with. It's well known that it calms you down. But that can be very difficult as well, because it's harder to, you know, get your ass up and go do something. So yeah, I think that there's also a balance to find in there, because as well, it might be also when you're so comfortable with, which is not a bad thing, but when you're very comfortable with self-pleasuring, if you end up having this kind of unhealthy relationship to it, it might even be detrimental for your own willingness to go approach other people and you know have sex with other people and explore that as well, which is also a completely different thing. But so yeah, it's the finding the right balance, because as I said before, you release a lot of dopamine, and then it's like you have it already, and yeah, I mean, I don't want to start this discussion because it could be an entire other episode, but there's a lot of like harmful effects of pornography and let's say an unhealthy relationship with masturbation, which is that you start, it's so like any other addiction, you start building tolerance to dopamine, and that can be harmful.
Absolutely.
For yeah.
I think it can be both. I think in general it can be a very like impactful thing for your body in both good ways and maybe, I guess. But I don't know. I guess if you, for example, like your habits around masturbation, I guess, do matter in some way. For example, if you masturbate watching pornography, that might like lead you to internalize some things you also see. But then, I don't know. I watch this YouTuber she talks a lot about kind of sex and also masturbation, and for her, she like talks about it in a spiritual way in some way, how masturbation for her, she doesn't necessarily think of sexual acts or or she doesn't watch porn or doesn't necessarily think of people having sex, but uses it more of like a where she kind of like it's more of like a self-loving act where she repeats, I guess, like positive things or what kind of person she wants to be, and I think like also the relationship with masturbation that we have with ourselves can like vary so much, where I guess for myself, I always kind of stayed away from pornography because I was scared that I would internalize also like the body norms in some way, and I tried to like consciously stay away from that because I knew that it would even subconsciously affect what I think a body should look like, what I think sex should be like, and in a way I didn't want that. But at the same time, other people may have a completely different connection with pornography, so I think
I wanted to ask you guys, so I'm gonna, let's say, put some sort of scenario. So because I wanted to talk about situations in which there's an imbalance of sexual drive within a couple. So this can lead to frustration, and it's a well-known source of conflict between two people in a relationship. What do you guys feel about masturbation in those situations as a way of let's say compensating for this mismatch of sexual drive, and also because I feel like one of the problems that comes with that is not necessarily the mismatch itself, because of course that can lead to someone's frustrated, right? But it's more the almost subconscious or indirect pressure that you can exert on the other person as a result of your frustration, which can become very unhealthy. And because, as we said before, there's a very common association between sex and showing desire, showing that this person is still attractive to you, that it's desired and loved. But then if your partner is not meeting your sexual needs, it might affect not only like, of course this will lead to sexual frustration, but it can impact your self-esteem and a lot of other things. So yeah, I don't know. What do you guys feel about masturbation as a
coping, not a coping, but as a result of sexual incompatibility kind of thing?
Yeah, like I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think that people talk enough about this idea of being emotionally compatible, romantically compatible with somebody, and then not necessarily be sexually compatible with them. And if they do
opposite.
Or the opposite, that's true. And if they do talk about it, it's not like something that is then like long term, if that makes sense.
Mm.
It's not something that can last for long enough, because it's kind of like, in order for you to have a relationship with a person, there needs to be those elements within the relationship. At least that's the way that I've perceived it. And then, so masturbating as a coping mechanism, I don't know. I don't think that it's problematic in its own right. I think if you want to be with somebody and you only want to be with another thing, it could also you guys could also just be non-monogamous.
Yeah,
you know,
clearly.
non-monogamous could go on to have to be a polyamorous relationship, so that one person's needs can be met while still being in a relationship with the other person who doesn't necessarily have the same sexual drive. I think that in itself is also just a conversation that needs to be had between two people. If that's something that, I don't see a problem with it personally, but again, I think that depends on the people. I mean, that also, there's some people who would find it a little bit frustrating in the sense, you know, like that you have to continuously masturbate because your partner is not in the same, or does not perform, or doesn't have the same sex drive as you.
The opposite is true as well. You might feel, if you might feel like you're not doing enough if your partner has this need, whereas
but you know what, I think the biggest thing in that situation is about communication. Continuously. I think it's about continuously talking and being continuously honest about what, it's not only communication, but it's really like honesty. It's being honest, and it's okay to like be, and I think that's the other problem is, it's okay to say that you don't want to have sex if you're with a relationship with somebody and that's something that you might have had before, or that it's okay to say I don't want to have sex regularly, or that's not something that I'm interested in, or that's not something that I'm feeling, whether it be because of your mood or because of your physicality or because of your sexual like orientation. Perhaps you identify as asexual and that's not something that you like, you fall in and out of the asexual spectrum. And so I just think that it's always about honesty. It's just being honest with each other, you know. I think that's the biggest thing that I'm noticing, is we just got to be honest.
I think,
you know?
Also maybe like discussing, because if like sex is something that like makes like two people feel close to each other, and I think that's important in a relationship, or that kind of there's an intimacy that, or I guess for a lot of people, sex is a way to feel close to a person. But then maybe like if one person doesn't always want to have sex, maybe finding other ways to feel close to one another, whether that's like without in a sexual way. Like you can be very like sensual with each other, I guess, like massages or like little tingly like things. I think those can all like make you feel very connected with someone without necessarily being very sexual. Or I think also like masturbating next to each other, for example, like if that's something people feel like comfortable with, can be something, or I guess like also finding pleasure in seeing your partner have pleasure by themselves, maybe. Like I think in a way that's how masturbation would, I guess, come in. In a relationship maybe, where there's like an incompatibility. Sexual drive, I guess.
So just to kind of sum it up, if I got it right, like in the end, there's more ways to connect emotionally with someone that don't necessarily involve sex, and therefore that incompatibility on a sexual level might not mean that there's an incompatibility on the emotional level, and there's ways to work around it. One of the last things that I wanted to talk about that we haven't really addressed yet, although you've mentioned you've mentioned it quickly when we're talking about masturbation, is the idea of body image, and the interaction, like, because you said that, because you said the masturbation can make you feel maybe more at ease with your own body, like more, because when you're more knowledgeable literally about your own body, and that can lead to more confidence. But that's also the case with sex. Being more having a healthy sexual life can lead to better self-esteem, but at the same time, so sex can be something that's very empowering, but it can also be closely associated with the idea of shame, and you might feel, you talked about the regretfulness of it. You might feel you might have some sort of discomfort after having sex, or maybe you feel degraded. Degraded might be a strong word, but what I mean by that is you might not feel proud of yourself. I don't know. What I really want to talk about is just how body image and how that plays a role in your sexual life. So I don't know. So when you were talking about body image, you were talking about how you didn't want to engage with pornography because you were afraid that you would internalize body standards.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I don't know. Do you feel like this pressure of having a certain body type, or like having, I don't know, not having body hair to be attractive? How do you experience that pressure? Is it a pressure that is internal? Does it come from other people and what things that you've been told? I don't know.
I think a lot of things are things, I guess we've I have internalized, and I guess I try to, like, I don't know, there's something you said about I guess sex can feel degrading, and I think I don't know, I think in a way you open up space for someone to, like, where it's like a vulnerable
You're
thing.
vulnerable, yeah. For sure.
And I think also, I feel like I have in some ways, like, sometimes felt like, not degraded necessarily, but like had like a feeling afterwards where I felt very, like, objectified in a way, not because the person did, like, on paper, like, everything was right, like, they asked for consent and everything, but I think the way they saw me, I felt, like, very sexualized in a way. And I think I forgot what I was gonna say.
Well, more like the impact on your self-esteem, like maybe I don't know where you were trying to go to, but
yeah, but in terms of, yeah, I don't know, maybe you can go first and maybe my thoughts will come back to me. But
in terms of, like, self-image during, like, sex and, again, mental health, I don't know, I think that there's a part of me that thinks, like, that vulnerability of being intimate with a person means that they are seeing you. And then some people will argue, yeah, you can have sex in the dark, though, or with your clothes on, which is fair enough. But I still think that it is this moment of being perceived. Yeah. And in whatever lighting or whatever you're wearing. And
ooh, camera died.
Oh damn.
How long is it? Oh, no.
Okay, it happened for another episode.
Okay.
We'll just continue the
podcast part.
The podcast will continue it, and you'll have, probably, if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll have a still image of us, and maybe we'll have silly faces, but that's okay.
But so this idea of being perceived and that perception, you know, one thing that we were talking about when we were preparing for this podcast, we were talking about the confidence that it can boost, you know, like, to be seen as, like, the sexual or sensual being, but also the inherent vulnerability that comes with being perceived in that type of way, or thought of in that type of way, or used in that type of way. I think that it can be something very empowering, and at the same time it can also be something that can be very, I don't know, scary, if that makes sense. Yeah. Scary, and also a little bit daunting. Yeah. And I think, again, that there's a lot of pressure for what bodies are supposed to look like when they are having sex, or what they're supposed to look like before, or to present themselves, and that has to do, again, with media and pornography specifically, and what the body needs to look like and the shapes that it needs to be in. But at the end of the day, I'm a big advocate for, like, show up as you want to show up. You know, like, show up as you feel fit. And if you're with somebody who truly cares about you, and maybe you're with someone who doesn't give a fuck, and that's fine too, you know, who doesn't like care about what you look like for too long, but what matters is if you care what you look like when you show up to the sexual encounter, when you're having sex, Who do you care? Like, do you like what you look like, and do you care for your body image? Hair, no hair, different forms, different aspects on your body, whether that be like stretch marks, whether it be like you flabby in one part, flat in another. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It's what you like about yourself more so than what the other person thinks, in my opinion.
I think I remember what I was gonna say. I think there's like with body image, I guess it feels like a lot of times like so much value is associated with the way you look, and I think I realized that once when I was like with a person who would compliment like physical aspects a lot, and it actually like ended up making me very uncomfortable, and I at one point like told them about it. I was like, yeah, this actually kind of makes me uncomfortable because I don't necessarily want, like, because it felt like sexually motivated, and where I didn't want that value associated with certain aspects of my body because they conform to a certain, like, I guess, norm of what a body should look like. So I feel like, it's both like the other person, but also how you, like, the relationship you have with your body. Also with body hair, for example, like, I think that's something I'm always like confused with, where it's like, well, do I shave because I want to shave, or do I feel like the other person, like, am I shaving for the other person? And then also, if the other person does have a certain preference, like, is that something I should take into consideration, or is it like my own choice first, or is it also something I would want to do for a partner? It's like this whole like internal conflict I have in those cases where, well, I don't really know what to do a lot of the times.
No, that's fair. That's difficult. And sometimes it's even because there's this thing where you're like, am I doing it for the other person, or am I doing it for myself? It can even lead to based on what you do, yourself not feeling confident and then affecting you, right? Like there's been situations in which you're with someone who, let's say, hasn't shaved, and they might assume that you have a certain preference, and then because of that assumption that comes from I guess from society and media and what is a body is expected to look like, it can also be the stress that is induced by that own thought is almost more limiting than whatever your partner thinks of you.
Exactly.
know?
Yeah, absolutely.
So so we're getting to the end of this episode. Would you guys? I think we should answer one question, which of course it's not a straightforward question, just like any other questions that we've answered throughout this podcast. But how do we define what a healthy sex life is, or how do we, I don't know, how do we define that, or how do we advise? What advice could we give to people so that they can strive for a healthier sex life?
Advice.
I think I would say, like, whatever works in your life right now, whether that's not having sex at all, whether that's not masturbating at all, or maybe only engaging with people in like a more casual way, like whatever at the moment works for you, and trying to figure out what works for you and is like puts the least stress on you and you feel the most comfortable with. And I guess trying to figure that out can be hard because there's also all these expectations around us that influence us, but I feel like probably that would be what a healthy sex life would look like for me, at least. I guess trying to listen to what I need right now, what works with my life right now.
I think for me it's blocking out what other people and what the rest of society is doing right now, and think what do I want? You know, like, what do I want in this situation? Like, when it comes to my sex life, do I want to be having, like, casual sex? Do I want to be in a relationship with a person where that's our, like, exactly, relationship with a person where that's what we're doing, just having sex? Do I want to be in a relationship and be having, like, much more I don't know, like intimate and much more relationship based sex? Is this something that I'm not even interested at all? Like, am I asexual or not? Am I a person who cares about this? I think we're at a time in our lives where this is the point to be exploring. Again, I think that every point of your life you need to be exploring your sexuality. I mean, at some point you like, hopefully we're all going to reach it, like to be older people, you know, and like to be able to explore your sexuality then. But I think you need to be continuously thinking about it and exploring it. And I think that we have these bodies that could do all these great things, and we should be able to like take advantage of them, you know, and explore these parts of yourself. And so that's what I'm thinking, is like, think what you want and what do you expect. And if it's not doing any harm to other people, and if it's not doing harm to yourself, then why not?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's super important to not think about your sex life as something that is fixed. Like, whatever works for you now, as you were saying, is important, you know, and it might not be what works for you in the future, and that's okay. So in order to always act in concordance with what you want, what works for you, and what works for the people you're having sex with, it's important to be honest with yourself first, be honest with what you want, and because if you just if you don't, if you're not honest with yourself, you run the risk to simply either regret certain things or miss out on things that you would have liked to do, to try, or to not do. So be honest with yourselves, and also be honest with others, in the sense that first of all, it allows them to understand better what works for you, because of course we're not in each other's minds, and although it's very difficult to openly talk about what you like, and we've touched upon it before, saying that it can be scary because we don't want to make the other person feel like they're not performing well enough, or that they're, you know, they're not we don't desire them. But ultimately, with good communication, everyone ends up having more pleasure and feeling less stress and anxiety associated with the fears that we have, the fears of exposing ourselves, being vulnerable, the fears of performing poorly, etc. So, yeah, listen to yourself, listen to others, and communicate.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for staying until now. This is probably the longest episode and the last one of the series. So thank you so much. If you've watched all the episodes, I really want to say thank you. This was a very fun project to work on throughout the month. And please feel free to share your feedback on what we've done, what could be improved, what you've thought. If you want to just share your insights or points in the comments, that would be super cool as well. I would love to read them. And if there's another another season of this podcast, then we'll see you in the next one. Thank you, and enjoy your day.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye.